Welcome to Talking Kootenay Books. My name is Keith Powell and I'm your host. I'm with Karl Koerber today. Karl is from the Slocan Valley. It's great to have you on Talking Kootenay Books, Karl. We're going to talk about your new book, and congratulations. It's entitled Through the Whirlpool. So just tell me a little bit about the new book that you've recently released.
Oh, yeah. Thanks, Keith. It's good to be here. This is, the book is called Through the Whirlpool, like you said, and it's basically a biography of my parents, who grew up in Germany in the 1920s and 1930s. At least it started out to be their story, but as I was working on it, I got really drawn into the story of Germany during that time, the rise of the Nazis after the First World War, and then their ascension to power in the 1930s, and found that history really fascinating. So a lot of the book is kind of a condensed, selective history of Germany during that time, with my family's story kind of interwoven through it.
Well, I have to say, Karl, you did a great job. I just really enjoyed reading the account of your family.
Oh, thank you.
And I just wanted to talk about the sort of the dynamics that were happening in Eastern Europe and Germany between the First and Second World War.
Mm-hmm.
What really prompted people to look to the Nazis and Hitler in particular, sort of as their savior?
There were just a lot of circumstances that came together in the period after the war. Well, first of all, there was the war itself, the First World War, which Germany lost. After the war, there was a lot of turmoil in Germany. There was a couple of years of revolution, mutinies, strikes, power struggle, really. The Kaiser had abdicated. There were the communists on one side, democratic socialists in the middle, and then the right-wing nationalists like the Nazis on the other side. So there was a turmoil. Then out of that, what coalesced was a liberal democracy that was known as the Weimar Republic. Actually quite a progressive democracy, but was saddled with a lot of burdens. The main one was the Treaty of Versailles put a lot of punitive measures against Germany.
So those were like war reparations?
War reparations, the loss of territory, which people resented and found humiliating. And this acknowledgement that Germany had to sign that they were responsible for all the loss and damage of the First World War.
So it was a very complex issue, but it seemed to me from reading your book is that it drove the people almost into a state of desperation, that they were looking for something better.
Yeah, well, there was so much. They were just weary, because after that there was a bout of hyperinflation where everybody lost all their savings. I mean, a loaf of bread was a billion marks or something. And things settled down for a while, got stable, and then there was the stock market crash of 1929 and the Depression, and that affected Europe as well as North America. And then there was 30% unemployment in Germany, and I think that kind of tipped the scales. And Hitler came along promising really economic reform more than anything else, and people went for it.
Right. So, I also found it really revealing that you wove your family account throughout the book. So it's a very personal memoir. You gave us a glimpse into what everyday life in Germany was at that point in time, and it wasn't easy. They were confronted with a lot of challenges.
Yes.
What were some of the challenges that your family faced?
Well, the interesting thing is that my family, my mother's side of the family, so my grandparents on my mother's side and on my father's side, were Nazi supporters. Not necessarily ardent, but they did think Hitler was the answer to their problems. Once Hitler came into power, their life was relatively good. They were on the right side of the tracks, so to speak, politically and socially. Ethnically, they were ethnic Germans, and they were conservative politically, and so their life was actually good, in contrast to people who were not ethnic Germans, like Jews and Roma and so forth.
So Karl, your book isn't about the Holocaust, but it does delve into that side a little bit and talks about the impact and the social implications of anti-Semitism. I'm just wondering, how did that affect Germans and the world at that time?
Well, yeah, anti-Semitism in the 1920s and 30s was quite prevalent and acceptable in a lot of ways here in Canada and the United States, Britain, around the world, really. And here in Canada, for example, the plight of Jews in Canada was worse than it was in Germany in the 1920s. Jews were well integrated and in the economy and social life of Germany in the 1920s before Hitler came on the scene. In Canada, there was a lot of anti-Semitism. The Mackenzie-King government put quite strict limits on Jewish immigration, even during the 30s when the Jews were desperate to get out of Germany. The limits on Jews was a lot lower than it was on other ethnic Europeans.
So Karl, your story is, as I mentioned, very personal. It talks about your family. And towards the end of the Second World War, we had the Russians coming in on one front, we had the Americans coming in on the other front. The German people, whom we often forget about, were sort of caught in the middle of that situation. And I think of my wife's mother, who was an Austrian, and she tells many stories of, to this day, she sees a pine tree and she'll say that pine tree saved our family because they would boil down the pine needles and so forth. So in some ways it was a very desperate time for people that were caught in that vice. Is that true?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That's definitely true. Yeah. Especially the last years of the war and the post-war period. The post-war period, of course, all the German territories that were taken back from Germany, the German people in there, the ethnic Germans, were forced out. So there was this kind of mass exodus into what remained of Germany of what were called displaced persons at the time, but refugees, basically. And yeah, there were a lot of food shortages, and especially in the winter of 1945, near the end of the war, there were a lot of thousands and thousands of civilian deaths just due to starvation and freezing and that kind of thing.
So just backing up from that, your father was active in the war. He was in Africa.
Yes, he was. Yeah.
And that I found that fascinating because I really didn't, before reading your book, understand or appreciate the fact that the German forces were so active in Africa. And so here he is. He's captured. He becomes a prisoner of war. And he's basically shipped all over the place. And ends up in North America on the West Coast. If
really?
I'm not mistaken.
Yes, that's right, in San Francisco. Yeah. He was. I think a lot of people don't know that there were around 400,000 prisoners of war in the United States during the war. Starting in 1942, roughly, they started coming in from Africa and other places. A lot of them from Africa, like my father. Yeah.
Right. So your father ended up moving to Trail. How did that all come about?
Well, he came back to Germany in 1947 after 4 years, I think, in prisoner of war camps. And then he seemed to be getting well established in Germany. He married my mother. I came along. He had a good job as a machinist, but he had the Wanderlust, I guess, and for some reason, I still don't know why, he decided to come to Canada. I think he liked the wildness of it and the opportunity, economic opportunity. So yeah, he came first. My mother and I stayed behind and landed in Quebec City and took the train, I guess, across Canada to Vancouver. And there there was a hostel for immigrants seeking employment there, and a fellow from Trail who had a machine shop in Trail had driven down looking for a machinist, and they connected and came back to Trail, and that's how we ended up there.
Right. Well, fascinating story. Just before we wrap up, what parallels, what lessons do you think we can learn from history and your book?
Well, yeah, that's an interesting question I've thought about a lot. I think the circumstances were, of course, really different in Germany than they are now, in the Germany of the 1920s when Hitler came into power. But the sort of sense that a large segment of the population had of not being heard, of being left behind, of there being this economic disparity. There was a lot of unemployment, a lot of poverty. I think we can see that happening today, the economic disparity, this rising sense of frustration, and that opens the door for right-wing ideologues, demagogues, people who have easy answers, who offer easy answers that will not necessarily end up working out well for us. Yeah.
So that also ties in a little bit with the title of your book, Through the Whirlpool. Mm-hmm. And how do you see that applying both to your book and now?
Well, the title of the book, Through the Whirlpool, I see as a metaphor for this kind of vortex of death and destruction that the world got sucked into during the Second World War, well, during the Nazi era and the Second World War. And there's actually a story that my dad told where he would swim in the Neckar River, which ran past his house, and there was a danger of getting drawn into a whirlpool. And he said the way you escape a whirlpool is dive down deep to the bottom where it's weaker, and you can get out of it and come back up. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. Don't try this at home, kids. But so I just see that as an analogy for my parents, really, getting drawn into this, and then they, fortunately, unlike so many others who didn't survive, they managed to get out and ended up thriving and having a good life here in Canada.
Right. Mm. So if people want to read your book, I'm assuming that it's available at local bookstores?
It's available online at Amazon.ca and in bookstores in the West Kootenay so far, and I hope to have it in the bookstores here in Cranbrook as well. Yeah.
So Karl, thanks for being our guest on Talking Kootenay Books. I really appreciated you taking the time to be here. I enjoyed reading your book, and again, I appreciate you being our guest.
My pleasure, Keith. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Keith Powell, and I'm host of Talking Kootenay Books. Welcome to Talking Kootenay Books. My name is Keith Powell. I'm your host. I'm with Naomi Miller today. Naomi's from Wausau, and I understand you're soon to be a Cranbrook resident, so welcome to Cranbrook, Naomi.
Well, when you get old, you can't quite keep up the garden.
So we're just talking about the release of the second printing of your book. Let's just talk about when was it originally released?
2004, and they had previous histories of Fort Steele, and I wrote to various publishers, and one guy said, if you've got a manuscript, hold it, we'll call. And they asked a few months later, send in the manuscript now. And it took off and was published and seemed quite popular even across the province.
Excellent. So that was the first book that came out. What was the date again?
2004.
Okay, so we fast forward to now. Heritage Books, I believe, or Heritage Publishing was the publisher at that time.
Yeah.
They opted not to reprint it, so I had the opportunity to step in and sort of help out. So I said that I would take the project on. I have to admit it took a little bit longer than I thought, but we came out with a new edition, the second printing, essentially the same book, but we added a few more features and a few tweaks along the way. So what we've really tried to do, Naomi, is just make the book a bit more contemporary. I wanted to talk about Fort Steele and your love of Fort Steele. What do you love about Fort Steele and the stories that come out of Fort Steele?
Well, I love the wild horse story, and then the coming of gold rush miners who went up the Wild Horse Creek And the fact that they had to make a ferry, because there was no known crossing of the river for people, particularly on foot or with horses, coming up from, generally coming from the States.
Right.
North.
So it was on the Fort Steele Trail, I believe, from Walla Walla. So they, you know, we take it for granted when we drive out to Fort Steele, we just drive across the bridge. But at that point in time, it was a real barrier. There was no access to Fort Steele. So I think the Gabriel brothers, they set up the first ferry. Is that correct?
Galbraith.
Galbraith, okay.
Galbraith brothers, yes. And the younger Galbraith brother, John Galbraith, quickly put in a ferry that ran, once you cut it free from the shore, the current would make it slide across to the other side. And, you know, because traffic was very infrequent, he set up some bells so they could be rung, so that he could know that he should go down and run the ferry.
So the colorful history, lots of interesting characters undoubtedly would have crossed that ferry over the years. And of course the genesis of the whole thing was the fact that they were looking for gold in Wild Horse Creek, and that seemed to you know, really spur the activity of an area that hadn't been explored very much up till that point.
No, it had not been. So anyway, and the stories of the people who came, and then all of a sudden they decided that they were going to be the biggest community, most important community in southeastern BC. And when they built it up, they sent a government agent that had been in Donald, BC, and the Golden, BC, down to start, shall we say, legal activities. And then 1894, the school started with one of the most famous teachers of the whole era of British Columbia history, Adelaide Bailey.
So she's got quite a legacy as being a teacher. How long did she stay in Fort Steele, do you remember?
I think it was 15 years.
Yeah. And then she migrated out to the West Coast for a while, but she did end up back in Fort Steele, did she not?
No, she didn't come back to Fort Steele. She decided to run away, probably forced the hand of her lover, John Fingal Smith.
Okay.
And she taught 1 year on an island, one of the islands that had Filipino migrants.
Okay.
And then she came back here. Well, she came to Cranbrook as a bride. And they were an interesting couple. Fingal Smith had one of the very first cars in Cranbrook, and he would take it out of the garage to polish it, but he never drove it very far.
So you wonder why he had the car, right? So a bit of a status symbol probably back in those days, right?
Exactly.
Very, very unique. So Naomi, I just wanted to ask you, we did add a chapter to the book, and when readers go through it, they'll find that as chapter 10, and it's about the Chinese experience on Wild Horse Creek. How significant and important was that to the history of Fort Steele?
Well, other settlers complained about the quiet Chinese because they would come to town and get their supplies, but not say, gee, we're doing well, or we've had a bear time and we're actually moving to another site up creek. It was quite interesting. And the Chinese were quiet and efficient. And the white men, if they found something good, everyone would know about it. They bragged.
Right. The Chinese kept it to themselves and were pretty quiet about what they accomplished. But they had a significant impact on the history of early Wild Horse and Fort Steele. They came in and reworked the claims very thoroughly. And in fact, if you go up to Fisherville, there's the Chinese graves. Is that not correct?
Yes. Fisherville was, they had their own cemetery.
Right.
With 17, but they let the bones lie in the dirt for, I think it was about 6 years. And then they collected the bones and labeled them and had them shipped back to China. All the Chinese across the country would collect the bones of the Chinese who had the misfortune to die. And that was a very unusual procedure, but the bones were to go back to their hometown in China.
Right. So that was something that they did on a consistent basis throughout the West. So often, a story that maybe we're not aware of or realize the significance, but the Chinese played a great role in the history of the development of Western Canada, whether it's building the railroad or in this case being in Wild Horse Creek. So I just wanted to ask you also, Naomi, there's a lot of famous names that pop up associated with Fort Steele, names like Norbury and so forth, and in fact locations that are named after them today. Can you talk a little bit about some of those famous characters?
Well, Norbury, among other things, he's documented very carefully because all the letters he sent home to England were sent back to the BC archives. And Norbury was a level-headed young man, and he came, and his first job was digging potatoes down near Fernie. And he got to be a magistrate and a member of the Liberal Party. He even went to Victoria on behalf of East Kootenay Liberals.
He played a pretty significant role in the early development and also the political scene of the early time. He was an Englishman, right?
Definitely.
And did he return to England? I can't remember.
He disappointed people who were watching him rise and depending on him and having his cooperation on such things as building new bridges at different places on these newly created roads. So.
Right, so he did play a significant role in a lot of development in the area.
And he was appointed a magistrate, which meant that, he would have to sit down with good old Robert Galbraith, who was, the guy who patted his own chest a lot, and Dr. McLean, and then Dr. Watt. Dr. Watt came here after he'd been up in Barkerville, and Watt was a bit of a braggart, but all the fun characters.
Right, so many colorful characters passed through Fort Steele. Of course, Fort Steele, your book talks about it being the gold rush town, the boom town. We know it as sort of the ghost town or the heritage town today. So it's a major tourist attraction that, literally thousands of people visit every year. So how does that make you feel when you look back on history and you see that history preserved in somewhere like Fort Steele?
Well, I have seen history portrayed in a great cross-section of BC history particularly, and they did a lovely job with costumes and the fact that they have animals and horses and that kind of thing.
So it really bears to the accuracy of the historical portrayal out in Fort Steele.
Yeah.
And the one thing that I wanted to mention is sometimes we forget about the significance of Fort Steele locally. And you know, there's so much to learn and so much to gain. So encourage people to really go out and experience Fort Steele over the summer. So again, just the reason that we're here, so it's the release of your second printing, Fort Steele Gold Rush to Boomtown. And so the book is now back in print. People can obtain it.
Thank you.
So it was nice to work with you, and it was a great project to put together.
Okay.
So thank you, Naomi. It's been great to have you a guest on Talking Kootenay Books.
Thank you very much.
So this is Keith Powell. I'm the host of Talking Kootenay Books.